Good morning, everybody. Thank you for watching this weather update. I'm Matt Reardon. The date is April 8th. It is a cold morning here across the Midwest. We're looking at a hard freeze that's mid-20s, persistent for a few hours now here across a number of ice states. If we look at those current temperatures here, I'm going to discuss the temperature conversation a bit here as it kind of go through the weekend and then to next week. But I think there's a fork in the road in the forecast. In terms of the precipitation pattern, probably the severe weather as well, given that we're into mid to late April in the forecast at that point. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the latest seasonal forecast. Eric went through that in depth yesterday. I'm really going to focus more on, I think, both the weekly models that we've been discussing, some of the patterns there in terms of precip in late April, and then that seasonal discussion are struggling with some initialization biases. Eric mentioned that kind of phenomenon yesterday. I agree with him wholeheartedly. We'll discuss what the models might be tripping up on there. And then as I've been doing a bit this spring, kind of compare this year to a year in the past. Not to totally say that this year's going to be like that year. We did this with 2012. We did it with 2011. We kind of contrasted them, looked for lessons in each of those years. I'm going to add 2008 into the mix. And I'll kind of skip ahead here for a second and say the reason I did that is because Eric mentioned some of the hurricane analogs that we've been looking at for forecasting tropical weather later this year, but also severe weather analogs. We did this earlier this year, and 2008 keeps coming up, and those ones as well. So if you want to skip to the end, you can see that comparison really quickly. To start here this morning, the current temperature map that you can see, again, those mid-20s stretching really all the way from eastern Pennsylvania into the western portions of all the way through Iowa into portions of Nebraska, Kansas, and then inching further south. So this is valid about 6 a.m. And you can see that freezing line getting down to the southern tip of Missouri here, avoiding the boot heel, but even getting into portions of Tennessee, maybe even far west Virginia as well. And these aren't temperatures 31, 32 degrees for, an hour or two. We're down into the mid-20s for a few hours here across a number of these ice state locations. So early April freezes are, always on the table this time of year. Kind of a stretch here along I-70. We're getting close to that climatological last freeze date, but nonetheless, this one still significant given some of the rain that we've had recently and some of the green up associated with that. If we look at the all hazards map here this morning, valid from the National Weather Service, outside of the freeze and then the flooding that we've talked about, moving through the Mid-South, relatively quiet map. We're going to be warming up here gradually in the Midwest throughout this week. We can see all those flood watches, or I should say flood warnings and advisories posted out for the Mid-South along the Ohio, Tennessee, and then the Mississippi River. We'll jump over and just look at the current radar presentation across the U.S. Again, similar to kind of what I've been talking about. It's a quieter week in terms of precipitation here this week that is consistent here on Tuesday. If we look really closely, we can see some activity here. Showers moving through eastern Montana, the Pacific Northwest, and then some snow showers here moving across the eastern Great Lakes into portions of Pennsylvania, New York, and New England. Southern Florida getting some precipitation as well on the kind of end of this frontal system as it moves through here. And some of the areas down here actually need a little bit of moisture, so good to see that. If I take you to the National Weather Service, their minimum forecast here this morning, you can see that freezing line, again, pretty accurate from where we just looked at in those current temperatures, kind of stretching anywhere from northern Tennessee through southern Missouri, eastern Kansas, and then those mid-20s across Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, some of the other Midwest states here. I'm going to take this into tomorrow morning. See that freezing line shifting further east, that gradual warm-up that I talked about in the Midwest. Colder temperatures now shifting east into Pennsylvania, down into that hard freeze territory, Virginia included in that, and that freezing line getting into the Carolinas here. It's hard to see here, just these are all metro areas here, but that freezing line likely inching down, kind of one of these backdoor cold fronts that we can see. If I take this into Thursday, temperatures warming up across the board. Friday, we have one of these clipper systems coming through. I'll talk about that in terms of precipitation, but it is going to bring temperatures back down early in the weekend. We can see that Saturday morning that freezing line, while less pronounced than it is here this morning, that I'm confident to say will continue to be the case, but you can still see freezing temperatures in portions of central Indiana, maybe getting into northern Illinois, central Illinois down to 33 degrees Fahrenheit, Michigan down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but outside of that, southwest and east, not as cold. And then into Sunday, that warm up, similar to what we're seeing this week, at the end of this weekend here, starting to shift back east and potentially starting next week warmer. If we look at the maximum temperature forecast, it's going to look similar in terms of that pattern. You're just looking at a greater number here. So this is Wednesday into tomorrow, Thursday, April 10th, Friday. This maximum temperature is really suppressed underneath that clipper system here. So clouds and rains likely. That's what you're seeing there. By Saturday, much warmer temperatures now for the weekend, starting in the central and high plains. That continues on Sunday, April 13th, stretching across into the Midwest. The eastern U.S. still cool this weekend. And then Monday, really most of the folks east of the Divide here, save for the northern plains, looking at some warmer temperatures. Now, I mentioned it's going to be quieter in terms of precipitation. We have that clipper system to talk about as we get toward the end of this week. But soil temperatures across the Midwest, kind of that same area where we're talking about that freezing line, looking at Jefferson City, Missouri here, kind of picking on them. If we look at the 4-inch soil temperature forecast from the ECMWF and GFS, climbs here gradually a bit over 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That clipper system comes through, brings in a cold front, not a lot of precipitation, very little, and then temperatures now warming up in terms of the soils as we get into the end of this weekend. That next warm-up was very aggressive, and then out into next week as well. Some kind of forks in the road in terms of the forecast next week. We'll talk about that in a second. But regardless, a lot of the kind of I-state planting area, planting window conversation, it's picking up very quickly here. This is just Jefferson City. I'm going to go east over to the eastern Corn Belt. Here's Indianapolis, Indiana. Had the tornado about a week ago. And again, temperatures suppressed this week. We have that freeze that we just talked about. 4-inch soil temperatures down into the high 30s, climbing with that gradual warm-up this week, back down after that clipper system. Remember, kind of central Indiana was the one area we did find that 32 degree Fahrenheit forecast later this week, but then climbing at the end of the weekend, staying relatively up next week. Some questions in the forecast here, but conditions now improving in the soils, relatively dry in terms of the soil moistures, which are consistently here kind of in the mid-30s, and that planting itch continues to grow here across the Midwest. Want to jump over, we obviously talked about a lot of the flooding rains in the Mid-South, and the rivers are starting to respond. I thought this one was interesting. So this is the the Mississippi River at Memphis, Tennessee. Now, this is a year-long snapshot, so it goes from all the way last April of 2024, takes us out to April of 2025 this year. And you can see a lot of that drought conversation we were talking about last fall, the lack of drying and the harvest concerns with just how dry the corn crop was coming out of the ground. This was the reason for that, or at least a reflection of it, just very little rainfall and moisture moving into the hydrology of the Mississippi watershed. That has gradually improved across the winter, and it's more aggressively improved here this spring with all the rain that we've seen across at least the middle Mississippi River Valley. We've talked about tornado outbreak in that area that was followed by flooding, severe storms, and then some more precipitation moving into the wider watershed as well. So this has just slowly improved. Now there's been kind of recurrent dry spells. We've talked about the potential for some overwintering of drought, but this just kind of speaks to the improvement across the board in the central United States of that moisture conversation coming out of the fall drought of last year. If we look over the last 7 days of accumulated precipitation, again, that bullseye that Eric talked about here across the Mid-South, a lot of different ways you can cut it, but it's just a tremendous amount of water over a pretty large area. I mean, let me jump over and show you a closer in view. Usually when we see these kind of extreme rainfall events, we saw some of them a few years ago, kind of in the similar area, eastern Kentucky, and then over towards St. Louis. You know, the swath, if I just kind of pick out South Carolina here, might look like that. Relatively localized, obviously significant impacts inside of it. This is a large swath, 9 to 10 inch plus of rain. If I could kind of contour 10 inches of rain here, I mean, this is a very wide area, and this is an area that is still pretty intensive for agriculture, certainly kind of in the Delta area of Arkansas, but even into portions of western Kentucky and Tennessee. So a number of unfortunate impacts are going to result from this. Even if I contour, the 7-inch line, just a huge, this would be, one of the biggest states in this area if it were. So just a huge amount of area dealing with a tremendous amount of water, and that's getting into the river networks here. Just pick on Cincinnati, Ohio, seeing the major flooding as a result of that along the river. You can see how high the Ohio River is there. Kind of another perspective here. This is the Reds Park here, and again, that river now just kind of almost encroaching on the bleachers at this point. Just you can see the effects of all that rain that we've seen. If we look at just the last 24 hours, this frontal system, we just mentioned it moving through Florida here, but over the last 24 hours was bringing some needed rain to portions of the Carolinas here. So there were some localized areas here which were lower in precipitation. And whenever we see these kind of, large flooding events here, if I even take you back to that national map, the departure from average here, you can see the southern plains getting into that precipitation, the Mid-South, middle Mississippi River Valley. I always stress it's not necessarily a zero-sum game, but there are always areas whenever you have high amounts of precipitation, there's usually a very strong high pressure system kind of locally driving that, and that tends to produce drought elsewhere. And it's kind of, these often work in tandem, so there's usually a high pressure system here that's funneling the air in, and you'll often get one up here, and we talked about that deformation zone. Eric mentioned that at the end of last week, where you kind of smash air masses together to get some of the flooding. And so you'll see maybe some dryness up here. Maybe we're seeing the reflection of that up in the northern plains or Wisconsin here, and then the reflection of that high pressure system here. So whenever we have this flooding here, I always look for the kind of negative space here of some areas that missed out on precipitation as a result of that pattern. Going to continue that conversation, look at areas that are lower on soil moisture. This is the root zone here. And again, seeing some of the areas that just received some more beneficial rainfall popping up here. So good to see that rain move all the way through the Atlantic coastline here. Some areas to continue watching here in the upper Midwest, the Central Plains as well. This map has been improving, I think, considerably over the last week or two with the rainfall getting into the Southern Plains, not drought busting, but improvement there, improvement across the Midwest, some of the I-states here. We just kind of talked about Indianapolis, how wet they are. As you go further west, still some lingering concerns. We'll talk about that at the end of this video when we talk about 2008. We have the ECMWF upper level height here forecast. Let's make it valid right as this morning. So yeah, 7 a.m. Tuesday, April 8th. Deep trough here across Canada. We're seeing that frontal system now move off and east. That's why that radar presentation is getting more clear. I'm going to take this forecast into, let's do Wednesday morning. This is now Wednesday afternoon. You've seen this ridge develop pretty strongly across the western U.S. Take it into very early Thursday morning. This is Thursday, 8 a.m. And you can see this ridge really becoming dominant out west, starting to inch its way east. This is Friday, April 11th. We're going to talk about this clipper system in just a second. That's going to bring those cold temperatures to the Midwest and then the eastern U.S. later this week. And that ridge is going to try to move east here or across the Midwest. This is going to bring that warm up back over the weekend. We talked about that. Another system coming in behind it. And this is going to impact more of the upper Midwest, the northern plains. We'll see how far south some of that precipitation gets. This is early next week. But we still have this ridge out here. And I want to pause it. Let's pause it here. This is about a week from the recording of this video. So we're all the way out at the 15th here. You can see that trough here across Canada. You can see the ridge here across the west. This is, the models have been kind of stuck on this throughout the forecast here. That is troughing in the east, relatively cool, ridging out west, drier in the middle, but with these clipper systems kind of coming over the top, bringing occasional chances for less significant precipitation. Now the question going into next week, we're all the way out now Tuesday, April 15th, this forecast from the European model is this ridge going to do one of two things? One, is it going to break down and allow these clipper systems to form more proper troughs that get into the central U.S. and the eastern U.S., bringing us back to an active pattern? Or there's kind of another way to do this. Is it going to be so dominant and so broad that it actually allows some of these troughs to sneak underneath some of these cutoff flows? Those aren't always super significant in winter, maybe in fall, they can be a lot drier, but in April and May, when there's a lot of Gulf moisture getting up into the United States, these cutoffs can bring a lot of moisture, thunderstorms, severe weather, and there's something to talk about. So we see this one kind of spinning off here, California. It's not uncommon to see these in April and May, but are these going to sneak through and cause havoc in the central US? That's kind of my question now, looking a week out at this forecast here. This ridge is just so dominant in the forecast. In fact, if I take you back, let's go all the way back to the recording of this video. So this is, here's Tuesday afternoon. There's that ridge across the western US. And you'll see it's going to try to move east, but it reestablishes itself very quickly across the west. Now I'm going to take this forecast out, and it doesn't change through the end of the period here. So we're all the way out to Thursday of next week, the 17th. This cutoff load does not move through in this forecast from the ECMWF. Still see the ridging out west. Likely going to see troughs sneak past here before diving into eastern Canada. Clipper systems coming in front of that. We'll take you through that forecast here. But there's that fork in the road after that I want to talk about quickly as we get through this. So today we talked about the rain in Florida and the Pacific Northwest. That'll be waning in activity as we go through the day today. So you get into Wednesday. This is Wednesday afternoon, starting to see that clipper system now positioned over Minnesota. Out ahead of that, some showers, maybe some wintry mixes. That cold air kind of lingers in the eastern Corn Belt here. As you get into Wednesday evening, early Thursday morning, you can see that precipitation picking up a little bit in activity as it makes its way across the Ohio River Valley. This low pressure system now spinning up here over Indiana. This precipitation here from the ECMWF, I want to stress a lot of these areas here, it's on the lighter side. So we're not seeing kind of massive thunderstorms move through. It's going to be too cold for those. Not seeing persistent heavy rain. It's going to be a quick hitter for a lot of these Midwest locations. We'll look at those amounts in a second. But now into the eastern U.S., portions of Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, West Virginia. that intensity picks up a bit here, and you can kind of see that in the contours here from the ECMWF on Friday afternoon. So more significant precipitation getting in here to portions of the mid-Atlantic region as we get into Friday afternoon and evening. See that low trying to wrap up here now just off the coast, potentially introducing some weather concerns to portions of New England and the mid-Atlantic. And then the low kind of parked there across the eastern U.S. before that precipitation finally exits a lot of these states here getting into this weekend. Now behind that, I'll take you back to, let's go to Saturday. Let's go to Saturday afternoon here, another low pressure system coming in behind it. That's that influence of that ridge here, just sending systems across. So we're going to see those come across here. They're going to be quick hitting. So this one very quickly moving through portions of Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota. This is now into Sunday afternoon. You can see it very quickly. Saturday evening race across the upper Midwest. At the end of the front here, a quick system moving through the Midwest. This is Monday of next week. But those are quick, not significant precipitation makers in terms of flooding or severe weather. We'll look at those amounts in a second, but you can see just how quick they are and how dry the rest of the country is. This is all the way out to Thursday of next week. Now, if I just show you the ECMWF totals from that forecast here, here's Tuesday. I'll just take it out to the end of the period. Again, that activity coming up and over the ridge, those systems are moving through so quickly. We're not seeing these significant rainfall amounts through that corridor. Maybe up near a half inch in some of these locations that get under some of the stronger showers. But we don't really get over an inch until you get over into the Mid-Atlantic, the Carolinas, or over into the Appalachians here. Again, struggling to get even up to a half inch of rainfall further west of there. Now the fork in the road that I want to talk about here, this is looking at the ECMWF AIFS. We've talked about how this spring, this model has had some good key in on some of these kind of long range forks in the road. That's kind of week to 2 week question mark. We talked about the ridge in the west. I'm taking this forecast into Thursday. Now Friday morning, see that ridge trying to move east. There's that next system that we talked about moving through the upper Midwest very quickly as we get into Sunday and Monday of next week. There's that cutoff. Remember, the ECMWF had this kind of parked off the coast of California. But by Tuesday, it was hard to see, but it actually snuck through here. It's now over the front range, and it's going to get out into the Central Plains on Wednesday afternoon from this forecast here from the ECMWF, and it's going to kick off showers and storms here, which is very different from the ECMWF forecast I just showed you. That low, the kind of original trough, is still out there south of California. This is the end of next week, and it now brings that across into Texas, Oklahoma, kind of that same area. And because of that, the ECMWF AIFS has a different forecast here. One, I'll take you through. There's that clipper system. We talked about that here on Thursday and Friday. Here comes that next quick hitting system across the upper Midwest on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, moving through here. Potentially that shot of rain coming through that kind of, again, that I-70 corridor I talked about. This would be very quick. I'm talking about 2 significant amounts of precipitation until it wraps up east into the mid-Atlantic into Tuesday of next week. But here comes that cutoff. It's now Tuesday, Wednesday. This is April 16th. You can see precipitation here getting into the Central Plains. This is an area where we talked about some areas missing out on the recent precipitation. We talked about the bullseye here, some of those dry areas kind of on the periphery of that. The ECMWF brings showers and potentially storms into that area, and more significant precipitation now into early Thursday morning. This is the 17th, way out into next week, Kansas City, and then moving through the Mid-South, potentially over some of the areas we just talked about with rainfall. Now, again, I don't think this would be too significant, but if this is slow moving and has thunderstorms associated with it, it's going to bring precipitation that we'll have to talk about, maybe some storms as well. Now we're out into Friday, the end of next week. We're kind of beyond the forecast confidence window, but I will say that trough does again cross the higher elevations here, and we have another one of these to talk about all the way at the end of next week. That's just from this ECMWF forecast. The GFS forecast, I'm going to take it quickly into next week. There's Sunday, bit stronger system here moving through Sunday and Monday, and that upper Midwest system would bring a little bit more precipitation, I'd imagine. It's still pretty quick. It was Thursday, Friday the 18th. It now brings that cutoff through at the end of next week, and this would likely bring showers and storms into this kind of same area that we just talked about. If I take the GFS all the way out to Friday of next week, you can see that there in the pattern. So this ridge, you can still kind of see it here. I mean, outside of that cutoff that sneaks through, pretty dry. So when these lows do sneak through, they're just about the only thing to talk about. So if this kind of dominant ridge stays the pattern moving forward, that's a question mark I had. Can we get some of these cutoff lows to come through? I think we'll know pretty quickly as we get into tomorrow and Thursday whether the models shift more toward that original ECMWF solution with the low kind of parked further out west and staying there and decaying, or does it kind of bend over to the AIFS and the GFS, bringing that through a little bit quicker? If we look at the total forecast from the ECMWF, we looked at this earlier. Again, kind of the summary here is not a significant amount of precipitation until you get into the Mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas, at least through Tuesday to Wednesday of next week. The GFS is going to be in agreement with that, save for that upper Midwest system is a little bit stronger on the GFS. So seeing that reflected here in northern Mississippi River Valley, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. But as I take this forecast into Thursday, Friday, and Saturday at the end of next week, you can see that divergence here. More precipitation moving into the middle Mississippi River Valley, the Central Plains. If we look at the 10-day average from the ECMWF here, again, just drier than average across much of the portions of the central U.S. here, even getting into portions of the western U.S. as well. The AIFS, if you kind of exclude that next weekend system, it's in large agreement here across the next 10 days as well, over the middle part of the country. Climate Prediction Center going warmer underneath that ridge. That makes a lot of sense with these systems coming down and wrapping up in the east. So this is the area underneath the clouds and the precipitation kind of over the next 10 to 14 days here in the area that sets the lower temperature contours from this current Climate Prediction Center forecast. The precipitation forecast does leave that door open for these troughs to get through here. So that's why you're seeing these higher contours here. I will note that both this map and this map, you're not seeing these very strong contours like we saw at the end of March and early April. So there's less confidence in this forecast going forward next week. I think we just talked through some of the reasons for that. There's still some model differences to work out. I think those will get worked out in the next 48 hours in terms of pinning down that forecast in the central U.S. to the end of next week. Now, beyond that, I think there's this question mark, is that ridge going to stay dominant through the end of April? I think the weeklies, and then Eric talked about this yesterday, the seasonal models have some initialization bias a bit. Part of the reason is that flooding that's come through the Mid-South. We've also seen a very cold year and a big lake effect snow year. I think that's still playing a role in some of the model initializations. In fact, at the beginning of this video, I talked about some of the lake effect snow showers. We're still seeing it, and it's April. I mean, it's just been one of those years in the Great Lakes here. So if I jump back and we look at the latest ECMWF weeklies forecast, and let's do 7-day precip anomaly. So we're rolling on a 7-day window out into the forecast here. I'll take this through. There's this next week. We talked about how dry that'll be. As we get into that next week, that opens up that potential for precipitation here across the middle part of the country. See that reflected here now in the 3rd week of April from that 7-day rolling window. This is kind of the 20th, the 17th, 18th, all the way out to the 24th. You can see this area of here showing up a little bit more active. That checks out with the forecast. As we go even beyond that, though, we see more of a bullseye here across the southern plains. This would be kind of your traditional tornado alley here at the end of April and early May. And we're seeing this reflected in some analog forecasts as well. Even portions of maybe Kansas would line up with that 2008 analog I mentioned if we get into May as well. As we take that forecast out a little bit beyond that, start to lose the signal here. So there is this signal that we're going to get more active here in the central, maybe even the southern plains here as well, in that kind of traditional tornado alley, and the southern high plains as well through the end of the month of April. Now, the ECMWF temperature pattern, this is, I think we're going to see more of the influence of the flooding that we saw. So if I take this through the next 7 days, we talked about the cold weather that's still being initialized here, some of the Clipper systems moving through. As I take this into the middle of the month here, we don't see that ridge that you can see here move or establish itself further west or east. It just kind of stays parked here across the western U.S. And I think this is a little bit more of that initialization bias. You can see the model really hanging on to the cold here. We had a lot of that precipitation. It's hanging on to the cold here across some of the Great Lakes states here, even where we saw those lake effect snow showers. So I think with all the snow they've had up in portions of eastern Canada, with all the rainfall that we've had here, the model is just a little bit stuck on trough here, ridge here. Now, we're all the way out now. I'm taking this rolling window out into May, and you can kind of see that here. I mean, it's just kind of stuck in this pattern here. Could this come true? Is it, really picking up a real signal here where it's going to be ridge west, trough east, much cooler in the Midwest and the eastern U.S. through the end of April, early May? It's possible, but I think the model's a little bit stuck on that. I think we might even be seeing that if I take you over to the seasonal outlook that just came out here. This is the April outlook. What you're seeing here, again, is that initialization, all the flooding that it's picking up here in the Mid-South. Well, that happened, so that's already baked into the forecast here. But if I take this into May, again, just dry across kind of a wide swath of areas. This doesn't look too consistent with what we just talked about potentially the southern plains going more active. If I take this over, though, and show you the temperature pattern, here's April, dominant ridge west, potential trough east. Go into May, ridge west, trough east, and then by June, you can still see some of those more seasonal colors here, ridge west, and then really almost over those Great Lakes. So part of me wonders if it's just over initializing cool here, putting a trough here, keeping that ridge west, and not keeping this active or progressive enough as we get into the end of April here and into May and maybe even June here from the ECMWF. I think that's part of the reason that we're a little bit wary of this forecast now. Eric kind of likened it more to the sea surface temperature conversation. That's one initialization concern. The other is what's happening over land and the water and the ice over the Great Lakes. There's kind of two parts of that initialization. And it's, I think, put into question some of that kind of May and June forecast for now. If we do look over at those sea surface temperatures, though, I want to touch on those quickly here. One, this is kind of the area that we've been watching of this decaying La Nina that's been pushing further west and weakening with time. We've seen this kind of burgeoning El Nino over here in the far eastern Pacific. Obviously, the ECMWF went a little bit more aggressive with that El Nino through the end of the year. This year, we'll be keeping an eye on that. I think that's going to remain a story to watch as we go forward. Eric mentioned yesterday this kiss of death in the Pacific, and that's kind of an area that we're just constantly focused on here. This, if you will, blue banana here south of Alaska and the Gulf of Alaska, off the west coast of California, stretching out into the Pacific. And the reason we focus on that is the same reason that in all those analog years for drought, that same area shows up cold. It's just a harbinger for drought in the central U.S. But to kind of pause the concern a little bit for that is just kind of a word of caution. I do want to bring up 2008 because that started to come up in the analogs for this year. 2008 was a huge year for tornadoes. I think, top 5 over the last 25 or 30 years, maybe even more. And if I take you back and show you 2008 on this same date, this is April 8th. This is your kind of textbook kiss of death that I just drew out. There's no kind of, when I was drawing it here for 2025, you almost have to squint to see it. It's obviously got those cooler temperature contours here, south of Hawaii, west of California, but that's signature starts to decay up into the Gulf of Alaska. That was not the case in 2008. And 2008, as we went through summer, tallied up the rainfall at the end of the year, was a pretty great year for growing a corn crop. At the time, we were above trend. 2009 would blow it out of the water, but drought concerns were nowhere to be found in the Midwest in 2008, despite looking like this. And unlike 2009, which started, at least in a sea surface temperature way, improved very quickly by the time we got around to the growing season, 2008 didn't. If I take you to June later that year, not still that textbook kiss of death, kind of that warmth north of Hawaii, cool off the west coast of California, stretching all the way down toward Tahiti, very cold in the Gulf of Alaska. I mean, just kind of everything screaming drought risk in the central plains potentially. And I think one differentiator between this year and 2008, there are some differences here in the Atlantic. This kind of warm pool, if you will, north of Hawaii was inched further toward the east. The cold was kind of inched a little bit closer over toward the United States than some of those other big drought years like 2012. But in April of 2008, we had drought risk here over in portions of the southeast, portions of the upper Midwest, portions of the southern plains. Similar areas that we've been talking about this year. We've talked about flash droughts in the southeast, some lingering dryness in Florida. We're talking about dryness in the southern plains, dryness in the northern plains here. By July of 2008, that drought risk continued. It's not like it wasn't a drought year for areas here in the southern plains, areas here and there, but it avoided kind of the corn and soybean belt. So we didn't see it reflected in kind of those national trends. But it doesn't, not to say those areas did not have drought. It just didn't get into the areas that were going to most significantly impact the statistics. Where we were dry, we stayed dry. And that's often how drought works in 2008. So where we started dry in April, we stayed dry going through July, despite some sea surface temperature differences. Now, that year, we could also see in March more severe activity further east. We talked about this year in 2025. In April, it started to move a bit further west over toward your kind of traditional tornado alley. And then May was the huge month for tornadoes in portions of Kansas, Oklahoma, stretching through the southeast, even up into Iowa. In June, the ridge stayed down here in the southeast. That's why the drought continued there, but it allowed precipitation, storms, wind, hail, tornado reports to move through the Midwest. Again, the I-states stayed busy. So despite the kind of very kind of kiss of death like nature, and it's not to say we didn't have drought in some areas, they kind of stayed on the periphery of our largest growing areas. In 2025, it's a little bit different. We have that Southern Plains drought concern. We have some of that Upper Midwest, Northern Plains drought concern, but it's more magnified. And we still have that lingering fall drought. It has been improving. We just talked about the Ohio River water levels. We talked about the Memphis water levels rising. So this area has been improving, but the reality is there's still a bit of subsoil moisture deficits in this area. Drought here across the Southern Plains is more established than '08. We do see that southeast kind of mid-Atlantic drought. This is likely going to lose categories here in the next update, given some of the rain that they've just had. And then we just talked about on the forecast. The mid-Atlantic has more precipitation to talk about getting in through the end of this week and then even into next potentially. So some differences with '08. It's not to say if those sea surface temperatures are going to totally rule the day. Part of the conversation is where is it dry now? Can be a big clue as to where it's going to be dry in the future. So we'll be keeping an eye on this, that kind of cutoff low conversation. Again, I think in some of the model updates that we see Wednesday morning, and then by the time I talk to you again on Thursday morning, I think we'll have a pretty good idea of if those cutoff lows are going to shoot through the Central Plains and return that potential severe storm precipitation conversation back to the middle part of the country right here. Eric will be back with you all tomorrow morning. Thanks for watching.